We consume plot every day in the stories that we hear, that we're drawn to, and that we tell. Plot is actually what keeps you reading as a reader. It keeps you turning the page. It's something that creates tension and a change between the beginning and the end of a story. So a lot of times we might assume that plot is the same thing as story, but plot is actually a narrative element of its very own. I think of story as being a series of events, something that you can easily summarize. This happens, and this happens, and that happens. Well, plot is something that involves more of causality. So when we're thinking of plot, we're asking, how does something happen? Or why does something happen? And as writers, we think of plot as something you do to kind of mess with your characters, to push them towards making a certain decision or a change, or confront their beliefs about something. So we'll often think about plot as being something that's really action-driven or really dramatic. And that can definitely be the case, but plot can also be something that's a lot quieter, a lot more subtle, as long as there is some sort of change or trajectory throughout. Plot is the way that you decide to arrange and develop the scenes in your story in order to reveal things about your character and to force your character to confront some of their beliefs, make a decision, or come to a change. And the key word there is decide. You, as the author, get to decide and choose what you want to do to your characters, what you want to do in your story. It really comes down to you and the choices you decide to make. So once you understand these elements of plot, you can then find the best way to tell your story. So regardless of the kind of genre you're interested in working in, these elements of plot and storytelling are things that can be useful across many kinds of writing. So there are two options for this exercise. If you're working on a draft and you feel stuck or you're wanting to kind of inject more plot and tension elements into it, you can use these exercises to do that. They're things that I often use myself when I'm trying to work out more of these tension and plot elements in my own work. And you can use these exercises to apply to a scene or part of a short story or even part of a novel, because these elements of storytelling exist throughout all kinds of stories. If you're looking to generate a story idea, I really believe that the materials for the stories that we want to tell are already in our existing world. They're out there, they're things that we think about every day. And very often as writers, we're writing in order to figure out a mystery. We're writing to answer the question of why. Why does something happen? So in this exercise, we're going to be using a prompt to ask why in order to generate an idea. For this prompt, you're going to answer the question, I want to know why. We're going to focus on something that is a human scale question, something like, I want to know why my neighbor is always angry, or I want to know why my grandfather never talks about his childhood. So feel free to use someone you know in real life or a character that is fictionalized, but stick to a more answerable human question rather than, I want to know why the sky is blue. When I was writing Pat and Sam, I set out by wanting to know why my characters would stay in a long marriage that might not be their version of ideal romantic love. So by asking that question, it really opened up a lot more context about my characters' lives, who they were, where they came from, what they wanted, and the kind of different ideals and compromises that they ended up making for themselves and for other people. So now it's your turn. You can sit down and answer, I want to know why, and fill in the blank. What don't you know about what you already know? And these questions can come from things that you already know and experience every day, from your commute to your neighbors to the friends that you haven't talked to for a while. So the next step is the what and the why of your story. In other words, the scene and the structure. And when we're thinking about scenes, we're thinking about the self-contained sequences that make up your story. By arranging scenes in a particular way, by creating scenes that will push your character to make a change or a decision, you can then create a sense of tension and create an emotional impact on your reader. And the more you know your characters, and because you've already defined who they are, you can then figure out exactly what scenes you need to write and what your character needs to be doing in order to push them towards making a change. So the structure of the story, in other words, the order in which you choose to arrange your scenes can actually help create tension in the story. So, for instance, you can choose to provide your reader with certain amounts of information, choosing to provide them at the beginning of the story or in the middle of the story or towards the end. All of these things will evoke different responses in the reader. So for instance, taking an everyday kind of story about a character waking up, going to work, and then coming home, you could have each individual scene taking place in a certain chunk of time, being a character getting on the subway and then getting off the subway, having a conversation with their coworker, that kind of thing. But the order in which you choose to arrange these scenes can then reveal more about the tension involved in the story. So for instance, by starting at the end of the day versus the beginning, it can introduce a mystery about what happened throughout that day. So the first part of this exercise is to work to create tension in your story. You're going to do this by helping to construct a plot for your character that will force them to confront their beliefs and make a change. So you'll take the goals and obstacles you've already defined for your character and then figure out what does your character believe in and how you can pit their inside and outside goals against one another to force them to confront those beliefs. So the first step in this exercise is to define a key belief for your character, something that guides their daily life, some sort of ideal notion that they have, some kind of definition for their worldview. And in doing this, you can then better figure out how to engineer that plot, how to get them to push up against what that belief is. Some things you might want to think about while figuring out what this key belief is for your character might come from the facts that you've already written about them. So use your imagination and use it to synthesize with what you already know in real life. What might your character and somebody in their position care about? What's important to them? What guides them throughout the way they act in their daily life? The next step in this exercise is to pit your character's outside goal and inside goal against one another in a way that will make them confront their belief. The next step in this exercise is to write a movie treatment for your story. And this is a very quick way for you to get down the external action of the story and figure out a structure that you'll then build out. So keeping in mind and incorporating all that you already know about your character and your story, you're going to set a timer for about 5 to 10 minutes and quickly just get down the overarching structure of your story. We'll keep it on the exterior. So think of a camera. Think of what a camera would film, what it would see. Use action verbs, physical verbs that describe the actions that take place in the story. And you'll also keep it really brief. We'll build it out later. The next step in this exercise is to actually define the scenes of your story. So you're going to be taking that structure that you just wrote and breaking it out into individual scenes, forming a beginning, a middle, and an end to your story. Within each individual scene, your main character is going to have a change that can be very small, but you want to think about how she feels at the beginning of each scene and then how she feels at the end of each scene. And in doing this exercise, you'll actually be mapping the character's external journey to their internal journey and synthesizing them together. So the beginning or inciting event will introduce your character's goals and obstacles, and as well as introduce to who the character is and the setting the story takes place in. In the middle scene, we think of it as rising action. The character will try to solve the problem of their conflicting goals. And in the end scene, something will happen that will force your character to make a decision and confront their beliefs. So for each scene, you'll want to note, how does your character feel at the beginning of the scene? How does your character feel at the end? What decision does she make and how does she change? I find this to be useful in my process of writing because the clearer I am about who my characters are and what they want, the more easily I can then create the scenes that need to be in the story.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to like and subscribe to stay up to date on all of our latest videos.